Elon Musk goes undercover in a motel. What he does next stuns everyone. The neon lights of the motel flickered in the evening haze, casting a dim glow on the cracked pavement outside. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to see anyone of note, let alone someone like Elon Musk. The motel, situated on the outskirts of town, looked ordinary enough, if you could call it that. Its tired signage, faded curtains, and aging exterior screamed that it had seen better days. But on this particular night, it was about to witness something extraordinary. The sound of a car engine humming to a stop broke the monotony of the night. A sleek black sedan, out of place among the faded vehicles parked outside the motel rooms, came to a quiet halt near the entrance. The driver's door opened, and a figure stepped out, adjusting his collar and glancing up at the neon sign above the motel's front desk. Elon Musk didn't need to be here. He had plenty of luxury at his fingertips, more wealth than most could dream of, and power that reached across industries. But tonight, he wasn't here as the billionaire CEO of Tesla and SpaceX. He wasn't here as the visionary who had reshaped entire industries. He wasn't even here as Elon Musk, the public figure. He was here undercover, disguised, anonymous, and for a reason that no one would expect. He had heard rumors, whispers of problems within his own companies and industries, things that didn't make the headlines but spoke volumes to those who had the ears to listen. Issues of safety, working conditions, and even allegations that were more than just whispers. Things that the public didn't know, things that were swept under the rug. Elon needed to understand what was happening beneath the surface. He needed to see it for himself, unfiltered. And what better place to start than here? In the underbelly of his empire, where the real stories lived, the places where people, employees, and everyday folks who kept the world running interacted far from the press and the polished image he projected. He moved toward the front desk, his eyes scanning the low-lit interior of the motel lobby. The clerk, a disheveled man in his mid-30s with a tired look on his face, barely noticed him approach. He was busy scrolling through his phone, clearly not expecting anyone to stop by this late. Elon cleared his throat softly, and the clerk looked up, pausing mid-scroll. His eyes widened briefly at the sight of the well-dressed man in front of him, but quickly masked the surprise with a bored glance. "What can I help you with, sir?" the clerk asked in a flat tone, barely giving Elon a second look as he swiped his phone screen. "I need a room for the night," Elon said, his voice steady and confident, though he made sure to keep his tone neutral, void of any recognition. "Do you have any vacancies?" The clerk nodded, his fingers tapping the keyboard as he checked the motel's system. The place was far from full, its rooms available for anyone willing to stay in a building that had seen better days. The flickering lights didn't exactly scream luxury, but it wasn't supposed to. This was the kind of motel that catered to travelers looking for a quick, cheap place to sleep, not the kind of place you'd expect anyone famous to stay. "Just one room left," the clerk muttered, handing Elon a key with a long number tag attached. "Room 7. It's basic, $60 for the night." Elon nodded, handed over the cash, and took the key, still keeping his posture neutral. As he turned to walk toward the room, he didn't look back, but he was keenly aware of the way the clerk's eyes followed him, his curiosity piqued by the unusual customer. Elon could feel the weight of his decision settling on him as he walked down the dim corridor. The stench of stale cigarette smoke, cheap cleaning products, and age-old carpets hung in the air. But this was the reality he needed to see. This was the truth that many in his world ignored or avoided, the stories of people who worked in the background, those whose stories were told through their actions, not their accolades. Room 7 was at the far end of the hall, tucked away behind an old, rusted door. The peeling number on the door looked like it had been there for years, a constant reminder of the motel's faded charm. Elon inserted the key into the lock, feeling a small but satisfying click as the door swung open. Inside was exactly what he had expected. The room was sparsely furnished, the bed covered in a cheap, worn comforter. The nightstand next to the bed had a cheap alarm clock that looked as though it had been used 1,000 times. The TV on the dresser was a relic from a decade ago. It was exactly the kind of room someone might expect to find in a place like this, a far cry from the luxurious penthouses and boardrooms he was used to. But this wasn't about comfort. This was about uncovering the truth, seeing things for what they were. He sat down on the edge of the bed, staring out the window into the quiet night. The fluorescent lights of the motel's exterior flickered intermittently, casting shadows on the cracked pavement below. He knew the next part of his plan wasn't going to be easy. Tomorrow, he would meet with employees, people who worked behind the scenes, those who had access to the information he needed. It would be their words, their stories, that would reveal everything he needed to know. And as he prepared for what was to come, he couldn't help but wonder how far he was willing to go in order to uncover the truth. What would happen when his identity was revealed? How would people react when they learned who he was and why he was there? The night was quiet, the only sound the occasional creak of the motel's old ventilation system. Elon sat on the edge of the bed, still feeling the weight of the decision he had made. He was used to being in control, used to navigating the complex layers of his world with a level of precision that had brought him to the top. But tonight, he was operating without the usual tools, the bodyguards, the publicists, the well-crafted persona. Tonight, he was just another guest in a rundown motel, about to learn more than he'd ever expected. The hours dragged on slowly, and as the clock on the nightstand ticked toward midnight, Elon found himself drifting into a kind of uneasy sleep, the kind that comes when you're on edge, when something big is about to happen. But it was far from restful. His mind was too occupied with the plan that had brought him here. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the dingy curtains, Elon was already awake, the plan forming clearly in his mind. He had arranged to meet with a few employees from different parts of his companies. He had told them nothing about his true identity, just that he was doing some research and wanted to hear their thoughts. He knew that some of them had experienced the rougher sides of the corporate machine, the parts that didn't make headlines. He needed to hear from them directly to get the real story behind the headlines, the things that often went unspoken in meetings. After a quick shower, Elon dressed in a plain t-shirt, jeans, and a worn baseball cap, making sure to keep his appearance as ordinary as possible. The goal wasn't just to blend in, it was to remain completely invisible to those around him. The less anyone knew about who he truly was, the more honest and unfiltered their reactions would be. No one would look at him and see the CEO of Tesla or SpaceX. They would see just another guy looking for a place to have a conversation. He left his room quietly, locking the door behind him. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few cars parked in the spaces closest to the rooms. The sun was still low in the sky, casting long shadows across the asphalt, and the air had a chill to it that suggested the morning was still unsure whether to fully embrace the day. Elon's plan was simple. He'd already arranged to meet one employee at a local diner just down the road from the motel, the kind of place that seemed to attract regulars more than out-of-towners. It wasn't fancy, it was, in fact, exactly the kind of spot you'd expect a tired worker to frequent after a long shift. Perfect for the conversation he needed to have. He walked into the diner, the bell above the door ringing lightly as he entered. The smell of coffee and sizzling bacon greeted him immediately. It was a place of comfort, of routine. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with a worn apron and an easy smile, greeted him with a quick nod, but there was no sign of recognition in her eyes. Elon felt the slight rush of relief. This was how it should be. He was just another face in the crowd. He took a seat at a corner booth, making sure to face the door so he could see anyone who entered. The place was empty for now, save for a few lone patrons sitting at the counter. The diner had that quiet, lived-in atmosphere that made it clear this was the kind of place where people came to unwind, to talk, to escape. It was the perfect setting for what he was about to do. He checked his watch. His first employee, a mid-level manager from one of his tech companies, was due to arrive in 15 minutes. Elon took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had done the usual rounds, the company-wide meetings, the corporate retreats. But this was different. This wasn't about grand plans or innovations. It was about understanding what was really happening in the trenches. What did the workers truly think? What frustrations, what struggles had they been carrying? Elon glanced up as the bell above the door rang again. This time, the employee stepped in, a young man, no older than 25, wearing a faded jacket and jeans. He had the appearance of someone who worked hard, someone who didn't expect recognition but took pride in the work nonetheless. He glanced around the room, then spotted Elon, giving him a cautious nod before sliding into the seat across from him. The young man smiled faintly, but there was a tension in his eyes, a wariness that Elon had seen before. When people didn't know who to trust, when they weren't sure whether the person sitting across from them had their best interests at heart. "Thanks for meeting me," Elon said, trying to keep his voice casual. He'd deliberately chosen not to give any clues about his identity. Just another man, just another conversation. "I really appreciate you taking the time." The young man nodded, looking a bit uncomfortable. "Of course. What's this about again? I wasn't sure what you meant when you called." "I just want to hear your thoughts," Elon said, "about the company, about how things are really going. I've been hearing some things, concerns, and I wanted to get an honest take. No filters." The young man hesitated, looking over his shoulder as though making sure no one was listening in. "Well, I mean, you know how it is," he began, his voice lowering slightly. "It's hard. Things aren't always as great as they seem from the outside. A lot of people don't get it. They think we've got everything figured out. But we don't." "Not always." Elon nodded, leaning in slightly. "What do you mean? What are the biggest issues?" The young man glanced around again before speaking. "Morale's low in a lot of departments. People are overworked, stretched thin. It's hard to keep up the pace. And then there's the culture. Some people feel like they're just numbers, just employees, not people. It's tough to feel like you matter sometimes." Elon absorbed the words, the weight of them sinking in. This was exactly why he was here. This was the reality that didn't make it into the board meetings, the press releases, or the polished interviews. This was the truth that needed to be heard. "And what about the leadership?" Elon asked, his tone neutral but curious. "How do people feel about how things are being run?" The young man shifted uncomfortably, his hands fidgeting with the edges of his jacket. "Well, that's the thing. There's a lot of talk, but not a lot of listening. A lot of people feel like decisions are made without them, that they don't get a say. And it's not just the lower levels, some of the managers feel the same way too. It's like the higher-ups don't really understand the day-to-day struggles." Elon's heart tightened slightly. This wasn't news he wanted to hear, but it was the news he had to hear. He had built his empire on the backs of people like this, people who worked tirelessly without ever seeing the reward, people who felt unseen. "You're not the first person to tell me this," Elon said quietly, "and you won't be the last. But you're right. It needs to change." The conversation lingered in the air, the weight of the young man's words hanging over the booth like a thick fog. Elon sat back slightly, processing everything he had just heard. This wasn't just an isolated complaint. This was a pattern, something that had been building for a long time, but had never come to the forefront until now. The young man across from him was clearly conflicted. He wanted to speak freely, to unload the frustrations that had been simmering under the surface for months, maybe even years. But at the same time, he was cautious. Cautious of the person he was speaking to, cautious of how this information might be received, and, most importantly, cautious of the consequences. "You're not the only one who feels this way," Elon said finally, his voice low but steady. "And you won't be the last. But this is the kind of thing that needs to be fixed. It's not about pointing fingers or blaming anyone. It's about listening, and it's about taking action. We need to do better. All of us." The young man blinked, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "You really think it can change?" he asked quietly. "I mean, there's a lot of people who've been trying to get that message through, but no one listens. Everyone's too busy." Elon's gaze hardened for a moment, the faintest glint of determination lighting up his eyes. "It's going to change. But it starts with people like you. You've already spoken up. That's a big first step. The next one is making sure the people in charge hear you. Really hear you." The young man's eyes searched Elon's face, trying to gauge whether the words were genuine or just a well-rehearsed speech. But there was something different about Elon's expression. It wasn't a leader's typical rehearsed calm. There was no corporate mask here. Elon wasn't looking at him like a CEO. He wasn't just another suit who cared more about quarterly earnings than employee satisfaction. He was listening. He was engaging, as if this conversation mattered as much as any board meeting, any product launch. You're serious? Aren't you? The young man said, his voice cracking slightly with disbelief. You're actually going to do something about it? Elon leaned forward, locking eyes with him. This isn't about me. This is about what's right. And what's right is ensuring that no one feels like they don't matter. No one should have to feel like they're just a cog in the machine. The young man's hands stopped fidgeting. For the first time in their conversation, he sat a little taller, his shoulders a little less slumped. Elon wasn't just hearing him, he was validating his concerns, turning the spotlight on them, making them visible for the first time. I know it's tough, Elon continued, but if we don't make changes from the ground up, things will never improve. And I'm not just talking about policies or benefits. I'm talking about culture. We need to create a culture where people feel heard, where they feel like they have a stake in the company's future. That's the only way we can move forward. The young man nodded slowly, a new sense of hope creeping into his eyes. I've never heard someone say that before, he admitted. At least not anyone in charge. I didn't think anyone cared. Elon smiled, the edges of his lips curling just slightly. That's because most people in charge don't. But they should. That's the first thing we're going to change. Before the conversation could continue, the waitress came over, her notepad ready, and she gave them both a quick smile before taking their orders. As she left, the young man turned back to Elon, his gaze fixed on him with renewed focus. The uncertainty from earlier had shifted to something else, something akin to respect, or perhaps just the relief that someone finally understood. I just don't want to see things stay the same, the young man said. You know, I want to be part of something better, but it's hard when no one seems to care. I get it, Elon said, his voice soft but resolute. And that's why we're going to change it. We start here with this conversation, and then we keep going one person at a time. We build the culture we all want to work in. The waitress returned, bringing their food, and the young man took a bite, his mind clearly elsewhere as he reflected on what had just been said. Elon, however, didn't stop thinking about the larger picture. He had gathered information from one employee, but that was just a small piece of a much bigger puzzle. There were many others out there with similar stories, frustrations, and concerns. Elon's plan wasn't just to talk to one or two employees. He needed to understand the depth of what was happening, and that meant continuing his investigation, speaking to more people, hearing from them directly. As he ate, Elon couldn't shake the thought that the real challenge would come when the truth about his undercover mission started to leak out. When the employees realized who he was and the reason behind his visit, would they still speak openly? Would they feel betrayed by the fact that he had disguised himself? Or would they see it as a sign of commitment, a genuine effort to listen without bias or the interference of his public image? Elon knew the risks. He knew the challenges ahead. But what mattered most was this: he had opened the door, and he wasn't about to close it. The conversation slowed as they ate, but the undercurrent of tension was still there, lingering in the air. Elon's mind was already working ahead, thinking about the next step. He had listened to one employee, but he knew this wasn't enough. It was only the beginning. There were deeper layers of the story to uncover, and he needed to meet with more people. More workers, more managers, those who had a real understanding of what was happening on the ground. But as the young man across from him continued to chew thoughtfully, Elon couldn't help but notice something in the man's eyes. It wasn't just relief anymore. It was something deeper. He was processing what Elon had said, what he had promised. And Elon knew that the true test wouldn't come with him revealing himself as the man behind the mask. It would come when the changes he promised had to be delivered. So, what happens now? The young man asked suddenly, his voice quieter, more serious. You'll go back, right? You'll actually make the changes you're talking about. Elon didn't hesitate. Yes, I'll make sure these things are addressed. But it doesn't stop there. It'll take more than me. It'll take all of us, everyone involved, to make this work. I'm just one piece of the puzzle. The young man nodded slowly, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at his lips. I never thought I'd hear someone like you talk about this kind of thing. People in your position usually don't care about any of this. Elon looked at him, his eyes steady. That's the problem. People in my position should care. That's how things change. That's how companies succeed. Not by pushing the people who do the real work aside, but by making sure everyone has a stake in the outcome. The young man seemed to absorb the weight of Elon's words, his expression shifting into something thoughtful. But it was clear that Elon was right. This was bigger than just a few complaints. This was a systemic issue that would require long-term effort and dedication to fix. It wasn't going to be solved overnight. Their conversation continued for another hour, with the young man opening up about the frustrations and challenges that had been weighing on his colleagues. But with each passing minute, Elon's mind shifted back to the bigger picture. The truth was sinking in. This was just one small motel in the vast network of his businesses. There were countless other workers out there, struggling with the same issues. He needed to reach them, hear from them directly, and, most importantly, take action. The young man, now visibly more at ease, finally leaned back in his booth, his expression softer. "I guess we'll see what happens," he said quietly. "I hope you're serious about making things better." "I am," Elon responded, his voice firm. "And I won't stop until it happens." They finished their meal in comfortable silence, each of them processing the weight of the conversation in their own way. Elon was already thinking ahead to the next steps, who he needed to meet with next, what he needed to learn, how he would ensure that these conversations led to real change. As the young man stood to leave, he looked at Elon one last time. There was something in his eyes now, a flicker of belief. Perhaps for the first time, he felt like his voice had truly been heard. And with that small flicker of hope, Elon could sense the quiet shift that had begun to take place. It wasn't just about the changes he would implement in his company. It was about changing the way people viewed their roles in the larger system, a system that, for too long, had been about profits and figures rather than people. Elon paid for the meal and stood up, feeling the weight of the mission ahead of him. As he walked out of the diner, the young man waved goodbye, a gesture of thanks, but more than that, an acknowledgement that something had shifted, something real had happened in this small, unremarkable diner, where two people had connected over shared frustrations and a vision for change. But this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Elon stepped out into the chilly morning air, his mind already racing ahead. There was still a long way to go before the issues were solved. And soon, it was time to meet the next person, the next employee, the next voice that would help him piece together the true scope of what was happening beneath the surface. There was no time to waste. He walked toward his car, knowing that he was about to change the way his empire was run. And the ripple effect of that change would be felt across every department, every employee, every corner of the world that his companies touched. Elon walked briskly to his car, the cool morning air biting at his skin. His thoughts were heavy with the conversation he had just had. The young man's words echoed in his head, the raw honesty and the skepticism he had shared. Elon knew that the road ahead was going to be much harder than any press release, any public-facing initiative. This wasn't something that could be solved by a few adjustments or cosmetic changes. The deep, underlying issues within his companies required something more, something real. And that something was the hardest part of leadership: change. He slid into the driver's seat of his black sedan, the engine purring to life as he glanced at his phone, making sure the next meeting was still on schedule. The young man had given him valuable insight, but Elon knew this wasn't the last conversation. He needed more information, more honest feedback. He needed to understand the breadth of the issue, not just a small sampling. As much as he hated to admit it, he couldn't just rely on his executives' reports and the glossy corporate messages that came through boardrooms. He needed to dig deeper into the employees' lives, into the culture that had silently built up under the surface. He drove slowly through the parking lot of the diner, his mind racing with possibilities. He needed to talk to more people. The truth, the full truth, was scattered across different departments, different workers, and he couldn't afford to leave any stone unturned. This wasn't just a mission to find out what was wrong. It was about rebuilding trust, and trust had to be earned, step by step. As he drove, his thoughts shifted to the broader implications of the day's events. What did it say about the culture of his companies when people felt unheard? When the workforce became fragmented, when employees became numbers instead of people, when they felt trapped in a system that seemed to only care about output and profits? That was never the vision he had started with. It had always been about pushing boundaries, about inspiring innovation, but somewhere along the way, the humanity of it had been lost. He turned left at the next intersection, heading toward the next destination on his list, a warehouse facility on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the kind of place most people associated with Elon Musk. This wasn't a factory where high-tech gadgets were being assembled or a futuristic space program was being planned. This was the underbelly of his operation, where the real work was happening, the labor that kept everything else moving. He had already arranged to meet one of the floor managers, someone who had been with the company for years but had never been part of the corporate ladder. As he neared the warehouse, Elon noticed the dilapidated look of the building, the peeling paint, the cracked windows that seemed to tell their own story. The workers that passed by seemed unbothered, but there was a quiet tension in the air. They weren't high-paid engineers or product designers. They were the ones who ensured the rest of the operation functioned smoothly, and in this place they often went unnoticed. As Elon parked, he could see the workers glancing up from their tasks, their eyes lingering on him, though they quickly turned away. He hadn't announced his visit. He wasn't here to disrupt the flow. He was here to observe, to listen. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil and metal. The clanging of machinery was constant, a relentless background noise that seemed to vibrate through the building. Elon stood for a moment, taking it all in, watching the workers move methodically, focused on their tasks. There was no pause, no time to think about anything outside of the job at hand. He felt like an intruder in this world. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't shiny, but it was necessary, and it was the reality that a company like his depended on. A man in his 40s approached, wiping his hands on a rag. His face was weathered, his eyes tired, but there was a quiet pride in the way he held himself. Elon extended his hand, and the man shook it firmly. "You must be Mr. Musk," the man said, a slight edge of disbelief in his voice. "I didn't expect you to show up here. Not in a place like this." "I know," Elon replied, his tone as casual as he could make it. "But I'm here to hear what's really going on. I don't want the corporate spin. I want to know what's happening, day in and day out." The man nodded, though there was still a trace of skepticism in his eyes. "Well, you've come to the right place," he said. "Most of us here are just trying to get by. It's not the easiest job, and some days it feels like we're invisible. People like me, we don't get the shiny bonuses or the high praise. We just do the work day in and day out." Elon's gaze followed the man's as he gestured around the warehouse. It wasn't just the machinery or the equipment. It was the people. They worked tirelessly, without complaint, but there was a resignation in the air. They didn't expect anything more than the bare minimum. There was a level of detachment in their eyes, a lack of enthusiasm that was palpable. Elon had never wanted that for any of his employees, but somewhere along the way he had allowed it to happen. He had let the focus shift from people to numbers, from innovation to profits. "I'm not here to make excuses," Elon said, his voice quieter now. "I'm here because I know we can do better. I'm here because I want you to know you matter." The man studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You really think so?" he asked, a slight edge of doubt in his voice. "It's hard to believe anything will change. We've been hearing the same things for years. The promises, the talks, but nothing ever really changes." Elon took a deep breath. He understood the frustration. He had seen it in the eyes of the young man at the diner, and now here it was again in the eyes of this worker. He could feel the weight of the years of unmet expectations pressing down on him. But he wasn't here to make promises he couldn't keep. He was here to make sure something real, something tangible would happen. This time, Elon said, his voice firm, "It will be different. It has to be." The man's eyes narrowed slightly, studying Elon. For a moment, there was silence between them, the hum of machinery filling the void. "You're not the first CEO to come through here and tell us that," the man finally said, shaking his head. "But maybe you're the first one who actually means it." Elon didn't answer right away. The skepticism in the man's voice was loud, but Elon understood it. It was the same skepticism he had heard from countless others. It was the kind of skepticism that was earned, not given. But this wasn't about winning over every employee in a day. It was about taking the first step towards something bigger, something more human. This wasn't about quick fixes or empty promises. This was about changing the way his entire company functioned from the ground up. "I'm not here for empty promises," Elon said quietly. "I'm here to listen and to take action. You'll see the changes. I guarantee it." The man nodded, but there was still doubt in his eyes. It wasn't gone, but at least the conversation had begun. And that, in itself, was progress. Elon turned and walked back toward the exit, the sound of machinery and the workers' quiet movements accompanying him. He knew this wouldn't be easy. Change never was. But it had to start somewhere. And today, it started with him. Elon walked out of the warehouse, his mind swirling with the conversations he had just had. The quiet resignation of the workers, their skepticism about change, it all weighed on him, but it only fueled his determination. He had come here for a reason. He was going to fix this. He wasn't going to let the corporate machine continue to churn without considering the people who made it work. He had already spent too long being distant, too long relying on others to give him the reports and filtered views of what was happening in his own company. But now he was done with that. He had seen it firsthand, and he knew that real change required more than just words. It required action. His next meeting was waiting for him, but as he approached his car, something felt different. The energy around him had shifted. There was a subtle undercurrent in the air that didn't quite make sense. Yet he could feel it. Before he could open the door, his phone buzzed. It was a message from one of his trusted aides. At first glance, it seemed routine. A schedule update, a reminder about the next meeting. But as he read it more closely, his heart sank. The message wasn't about logistics. It was about something far more troubling. A company-wide report had just leaked. The contents of it were damning, detailing extensive and systemic issues. Issues that directly contradicted the image he had been trying to project during these undercover meetings. The leak was carefully crafted, but it was clear that it was no accident. The details, everything from accounts of unsafe working conditions to unsanctioned policies from the higher-ups, painted a picture of corporate neglect, one that Elon hadn't anticipated. As much as he had known that problems existed, this was more than he had bargained for. His mind raced. How had this report gotten out? And more importantly, who had authorized it? He quickly scrolled through his messages and saw another alert, a more recent one from one of his senior managers. The message was even more troubling. It mentioned a group of employees who had been systematically silenced, retaliated against when they tried to speak out. And at the center of it all was one person, a senior executive within the company, a trusted individual who had been quietly escalating these issues for months, if not years. Elon had known about the disgruntled employees, the hidden frustrations, but this was a revelation of a different magnitude. Someone had been pulling the strings from the inside, creating a rift that had festered beneath the surface while he had focused on the bigger picture. "Damn it," Elon muttered under his breath, slamming his phone against the seat of his car. He had walked into this undercover mission to see how his companies were really functioning, to hear the truth that no one dared to speak aloud. But now the truth was louder than ever. His trust in the very people he relied on was in question, and it was clear that someone had been taking advantage of the system. The air around him seemed to thicken. The clock was ticking. This wasn't just about his companies anymore. It was about protecting the integrity of everything he had built. The thought of someone betraying that trust from the inside made his blood run cold. With his jaw clenched, Elon hit the ignition button on his car. The next part of his plan wasn't going to be easy, but it had to happen. The executive who had orchestrated this leak, who had caused these issues to spiral out of control, needed to be confronted. He needed to be exposed. As he drove to the next meeting, his mind shifted into problem-solving mode. He couldn't go public yet, not until he had all the information, all the facts. But one thing was certain: the people responsible for this would not go unpunished. The trust he had placed in his team had been violated, and he would not let it slide. Elon arrived at his next location, the headquarters of one of his subsidiary companies. It was a sleek building with modern architecture, the kind of place that screamed success on the outside. But Elon wasn't fooled. Beneath the shiny exterior, he knew what was really happening behind closed doors. This wasn't about the technology or the future. It was about the people who had become pawns in a corporate game they didn't even know they were playing. He entered the building where his meeting was already set up. The room was sleek, designed to look efficient and sophisticated. As Elon sat down, the door to the conference room opened, and in walked the very executive who had been pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Someone Elon had trusted. Someone who had always spoken about the company's vision in glowing terms. The man had a confident stride, a well-tailored suit, and the look of someone who was used to having power. But as he caught sight of Elon sitting there, his confidence faltered for just a moment. It was enough of a flicker to let Elon know that this wasn't going to be as easy as he had hoped. "Mr. Musk," the executive greeted him, his tone dripping with false warmth. "It's good to see you. I assume everything is going well with your investigations." Elon leaned back in his chair, looking the executive directly in the eye. His voice was calm, but the weight of the moment was clear. "It was going well until I found out about the report. And about the way you've been handling things behind closed doors." The executive froze, his smile slowly fading. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice slightly strained. But Elon could hear the subtle cracks in his tone, the fear that was starting to bleed through. "I think you do," Elon replied, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. "The report that just leaked. The one that details everything from retaliation against employees to unsafe working conditions. The one you've been trying to suppress." The executive's eyes widened, his expression morphing from confident to defensive in an instant. He took a step back, trying to recover, but Elon wasn't done. "I don't know how long you thought you could get away with this. But it ends now," Elon said, his voice colder, more decisive. "I've been hearing the stories, and now I've seen enough. You're going to take responsibility for this, or you're going to leave. I'll expose everything if I have to." The executive's face drained of color, his hands trembling as he tried to find his words. "You can't do this. You don't understand." Elon interrupted, his voice cutting through the man's stammering. "I understand more than you think. You've been covering up the truth for far too long, and I'm not going to let you ruin everything we've built." The executive opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The realization that his secret was exposed, that his actions had been discovered, was sinking in. He knew his time was running out. For the first time, Elon smiled, cold and knowing. "This is where your downfall begins," he said quietly. The room was still, the tension in the air thick with unspoken words. Elon watched as the executive shifted uncomfortably, his posture betraying the anxiety that was slowly crawling up his spine. He had always been the one in control, the one with the power, the one who made the decisions. But now, in the face of Elon's calm yet unwavering gaze, it was clear that the power had shifted. The executive was no longer the one who held the reins. He was simply another player, exposed for his own misdeeds. Elon's words had landed. The moment he had known would come had finally arrived, and the realization that his secret was no longer safe seemed to be sinking in deeper with each passing second. The executive's attempts to hide behind his polished exterior were quickly unraveling, and Elon could see the cracks appear, tiny fissures of desperation creeping into his eyes. "I didn't think you'd figure it out," the executive muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, as though trying to justify his actions even as the walls of his empire crumbled around him. "I thought I had it under control. Everything. It was just easier this way." Elon's expression didn't change, but his mind was racing. It wasn't just the corporate decisions or the poor treatment of employees that had enraged him. It was the audacity of it all. The idea that someone could get away with this for so long, thinking they were above accountability, was infuriating. Elon had seen it all too many times. The ego, the corruption, the disregard for the very people who kept the company afloat. This had to stop, and it had to stop now. "You thought you could keep getting away with it?" Elon asked, his voice quieter now, but the coldness in it was enough to make the executive flinch. "You thought I wouldn't notice? Or worse, that I wouldn't care?" The executive opened his mouth to respond, but the words died in his throat. His earlier confidence had evaporated. replaced by an air of helplessness. This wasn't a confrontation he could win. Not anymore. Not when Elon was standing there holding all the cards. "You're going to lose everything," Elon continued, his voice steady, almost clinical now. "Your position, your influence, your reputation. It's all going to come crashing down because you chose to put your personal gain over the well-being of the people who built this company. And I'm going to make sure that everyone knows exactly why." The executive took a step back, his eyes darting to the door as if he could somehow escape. But he knew there was no way out. His empire was crumbling, and he was powerless to stop it. The truth had come to light, and there was nothing he could do to hide it any longer. "I never wanted things to get this bad," the executive mumbled, his voice cracking slightly. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I thought if I kept things running smoothly on the surface, no one would notice the cracks." Elon's eyes narrowed. "That's the problem. You never cared about what was underneath, only what people saw on top. But the cracks are visible now, and they're deep. And you're going to pay the price for ignoring the very people who trusted you." The executive's face contorted in a mixture of fear and frustration. "You don't understand," he spat, his voice rising slightly. "I had to do it this way. I had to keep things running. People would have left if they knew what was really happening. I was protecting the company. I was protecting the brand." Elon stood up slowly, walking around the table to close the distance between them. He didn't raise his voice, but his presence alone was enough to make the executive take another step back, his back now pressed against the wall. The desperation was evident, and Elon could feel the power shift even further in his favor. "You weren't protecting the company," Elon said coldly, his gaze never leaving the executive's eyes. "You were protecting yourself. And now everything you've built is falling apart. The company's not a brand, it's a people-driven machine. And you've treated it like a cash cow, not a community." The executive's face paled. It wasn't just the confrontation that scared him. It was the fact that Elon's words were cutting through the lies he had been telling himself for so long. He had convinced himself that what he was doing was for the greater good, that he was keeping the wheels of progress turning, no matter the cost. But now it was clear that those lies had only brought him to this moment, exposed, cornered, and facing the consequences of his actions. "You've been running a shadow company, haven't you?" Elon pressed, his voice steady but firm. "The internal reports, the safety violations, the retaliation against employees, it's all part of the same story. You've been covering up the truth, and now it's time to pay for it." The executive swallowed hard, his face flushed with panic. I didn't mean for it to go this far. It got out of hand. The pressure, the demands. I thought if I just kept pushing, kept making the numbers look good, I could turn it around." Elon's expression remained hard, unyielding. "You should have been listening to your employees. You should have been focusing on the people who built this company. But instead, you thought you could keep getting away with it. Now it's over." The door to the conference room opened suddenly, and two security officers stepped inside, their presence unmistakable. They were there to take action, to remove the executive from the premises, to ensure that the chain of command no longer protected him. The executive looked at them, then back at Elon, his face a mix of disbelief and shame. "You're done," Elon said simply, his voice final. The executive stood there, frozen for a moment, as if hoping that he could somehow escape this fate. But he knew deep down that it was too late. The walls had closed in around him. His empire, built on lies and manipulation, was crashing down, and there was no way to stop it. As the security officers escorted the executive out of the room, his shoulders slumped, his face pale with defeat, Elon stood still, watching him go. This wasn't about personal triumph or a sense of victory. This was about something much more profound. The reality of corporate responsibility had finally hit home. The reckoning had come, and the people who had been ignored for too long were finally going to see change. Elon exhaled deeply, his thoughts already racing toward the next steps. The damage was done, but it wasn't irreversible. The road ahead would be long, but it had to start with this. It had to start with accountability, and the first step had just been taken. As the door clicked shut behind the two security officers, Elon stood still for a moment, letting the silence settle in. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air, but it wasn't the silence of defeat. It was the calm before a storm, the quiet after a long, necessary reckoning. The executive had been removed, exposed for his betrayal, and now it was time to rebuild, to reset. Elon knew that the road ahead was far from easy. He had taken the first step, but the truth was just beginning to come to light. The impact of this moment would ripple out across the employees, across the company, and even beyond. It wasn't just about removing a corrupt figurehead. It was about showing the world that accountability still mattered. It was about proving that no one, no matter how high up, was above the system of responsibility they had all agreed to uphold. But what did it really mean for the future? What would happen next? Was this a one-time gesture, a symbolic victory, or was this the beginning of something much bigger? Could the change Elon promised really be delivered? As he stood in the room, alone now, the thoughts swirled in his mind. This wasn't just about punishment. This was about creating a new culture, one where everyone, no matter their role, felt heard, valued, and protected. It was about turning the focus back onto the people who made everything possible, who worked behind the scenes without ever asking for recognition. The work wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. And so, Elon knew this moment would be one for the history books, but it wouldn't be the headline. The real story would be told in the actions that followed, when the people he had pledged to support saw that he meant what he said, that the changes would come and that they were, at last, a part of something bigger than themselves. The first steps had been taken, and now it was time for the world to watch, to see if the promises could turn into real action, and if the culture of his empire could truly be transformed.